Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 14th, where, believe it or not, we are talking about our final graded speech, which happens to be the persuasive speech. So I had assigned for us to discuss today Chapter 14, which is about persuasive speeches, and also Chapter 15, which is about diversifying speeches. And if you haven't already guessed, your attendance question for today will be for you to review speech number 2, the informative speech, posted by your classmates, and to send me via email a strength and weakness of each of those speeches, much like you did with speech number 1, but more on this later. So the persuasive speech, which is going to be due on Thursday, the 21st, is the longest of the three speeches, probably the most challenging of the three speeches. And you have 15 minutes to try to convince your audience to either support a position or take an action or both. And you are also going to be required to use a minimum of 3 outside resources. Now, you can use any configuration that you'd like. So you can use 3 online resources or perhaps a print resource and a couple of online resources, however it is that you want to do that. Regardless, though, you do want to make sure that your resources are accurate. And we talked a little bit about outside sources a couple of classes back, and the GCC library and some of the advantages of using databases. And I'm asking that you list those sources on your speaking outline that you would be submitting it to me, as you always do when you are delivering a speech, so that I can quickly look at those resources. I'm not asking that they be formatted in any particular way, though if you are familiar with the MLA, the Modern Language Association, that's usually considered the standard way for formatting sources from the humanities, and that would also include public speaking, though you might be familiar with the APA, the American Psychological Association, which is a slightly different system with the same intent, which is basically just to allow your reader or audience enough information so that they can verify your sources. The good news is that when you are quoting from an outside source in a speech, you don't have to be as detailed in the way that you would be in your writing. So you know that when you're writing a paper, you need to use quotation marks, and you usually, at least in the MLA, use parenthetical documentation, parentheses after that quote, that lists the minimum amount of information that would be necessary for a reader to determine where that quote appeared, something like a page number, for instance. And then at the ending of your paper, you list all of the works that you've cited, all of the works that you've quoted, and you list them by author's last name in alphabetical order. And there's slightly different formats for a book as opposed to a website, as opposed to an interview, and so forth and so on. Things are a lot easier when you are giving a speech because, of course, you don't want to inundate your audience with too much minutia and too much detail. So basically, just cueing in your audience so your audience is aware when you are sharing information that is not yours originally, using something like a tag before that information, stating something to the effect of according to the CDC, or even according to experts. So it's very clear that the information that follows after that is not yours. And of course, you should be able to provide more information if your audience members were to need it or to require it, such as all of the detail that you would be giving in an academic paper. Now, as you will see with speech 2, and the same will be with speech 3, I no longer use the template that I used with speech 1, which is basically just to help give you a formula of the way that you should be putting together a speech. At this point, now that we've got the formula down in terms of the introduction, the body, and the conclusion, and some of the elements that are evaluated in a speech, or some of the elements that you need to consider when you're delivering a speech, I basically just take notes of your speeches indicating strengths and weaknesses. So this is what you will experience with the persuasive speech and also with the informative speech. So, you need to convince your audience about a belief or an action or a little bit of both. I'm not sure which is easier. Sometimes I think it's easier to convince an audience to take an action, something like to sign a petition, which may not necessarily reflect their belief system, but the person signing the petition might do so just to perhaps have a photo op opportunity, or perhaps just so that they're no longer bothered by the petition seeker. And though I can think of how sometimes it's more difficult to change a belief or to change an action than it is to change a belief. I think most of us believe in healthy eating and in exercise, but to actually get people to act on that can be very difficult. So it depends, and sometimes your persuasive speech talks about both beliefs and actions. Your persuasive topic needs to be about something that can be debated, something that is not considered a fact, but something that is opinion based. What is ideal is if you can refute, at least briefly, the opposing viewpoints, rather than what I call ignoring the elephant in the room, acting as if there's no other position than yours, which is more than likely to frustrate, perhaps even alienate your audience. Instead, acknowledge their other positions. Now, granted, you need to do this briefly because you don't want to lose control of your speech. The focus of the speech is on your position, not on opposing positions, but at least acknowledging and trying to refute them briefly to the best of your ability just gives you some more credibility. Outside sources also give you credibility, which is one of the reasons why you're required to use outside resources for this third speech. You might have elected to use outside resources for the second speech, the informative speech, but you weren't necessarily required to. You were required to use audio visuals. And for this third speech, you can make the decision as to whether or not you want to use audio visuals. Basically, what I've done is I've taken a longer, more complex speech and I've divided it up into pieces. So the first was the informative speech, where you shared a little bit of information about yourself. And chances are, when you are delivering a speech, you might be sharing information about yourself. But chances are, when you're delivering a speech, you're also going to share information. That was the informative speech. And chances are you'll use audio visuals to help your audience understand and retain the information. And chances are that there's a persuasive element within your speech. So you will be trying to persuade your audience to support a belief or action or both. And if nothing else, you're trying to persuade your audience that the topic is important and worth listening to. And if you use outside resources, that just gives you credibility. So I suppose in the ideal world, we would put together all of the elements of all of the three graded speeches that we've had for a much longer speech. I've just divided it up into pieces so that we could practice different skills. So no, you are not required to use an audio visual in your third speech, but you might find it to be very useful. Just like you weren't required to use outside resources in your second speech, though you might have found it to be useful. You are required to use outside resources, however, in the last speech. And there are lots of different ways to try to motivate an audience and to try to convince an audience. This could be a class in and of itself, but I just wanted to talk about motivational appeals very briefly. Ways that you can more than likely persuade or motivate an individual to engage in a particular behavior or support a particular belief. Advertisers do this all the time. There are three major ones. One is affiliation or belonging. We all want to belong to the group. And think about how this is done with advertising, with commercials that will promote something like the number one product. The idea is that we want to belong to the group that supports that product. Or achievement, success, which in some ways is the exact opposite of belonging, because not everybody can achieve success. So the idea of being exceptional. Again, think about how television commercials might do this, let's say with an automobile, that if you drive an exclusive automobile, chances are you've achieved a certain level of success in your life, and that would be apparent by the visuals and the audio in the television advertisement, let's say. And power, control. And again, using an automobile advertisement, think about the idea of how ultimately you get to control the car. You may not be able to control your family, your friends, your workplace, your health, but when you are behind the wheel, you can completely control that particular environment. Fear is probably the most persuasive and also the most dangerous motivational appeal. That, yes, it is effective, fear, and we see how the media uses this all of the time. The problem with fear is that it interferes with reasoning. So you need to be very careful when you're using fear. And keep in mind how we began the semester by talking about ethos or ethics. You can use fear with some ethical purposes in mind. I think about, for instance, public service announcements that might warn against the dangers of drinking and driving by showing some, let's say, horrific car accidents. Obviously, fear is being used as a motivator for greater good, hopefully. So I guess you need to ask yourself, do the ends justify the means? So there is something called Monroe's motivated sequence, which is a sequence that usually is followed when you're trying to convince somebody of something. Basically, we've been intuitively doing this all semester long, and the way that it breaks down is that you need to get your audience's attention. You need to show that there's a particular need. You need to satisfy that need by giving information of how that need could be satisfied. You need to help the audience visualize how life would be better or worse if that need were met or not. And then if you want your audience to take any kind of action, again, salespeople will follow this particular formula. So what you're doing is you're putting together an argument. An argument is a claim with evidence and a reasoning pattern. And there are lots of different claims that you can make. You can make a claim of fact, but even that is somewhat debatable when you're saying something is or is not the case. For instance, GCC is a small school, which is a fact, but in comparison to what? It could be viewed as a large school. And I've had students say that GCC is a large school, depending on what their point of comparison happens to be. Or claim of value that something is good or bad, and that could be very subjective. Again, we'll use GCC. GCC is a good school. What kind of measurement are we going to use to determine that? Graduation rates, class sizes, transfer rates, and of course, there's a claim of policy where you are indicating that there should be a course of action taken, which is tricky because you don't know what the consequences will be until that action is taken and you can evaluate. So let's say something like GCC should reestablish a sports program, which I've heard before. And GCC used to have a sports program, which was eliminated because of budgetary concerns. And of course, the question is that will remain unanswered is, have we saved more money by eliminating that sports program because we didn't have to invest, let's say, in equipment and staff? Or did we lose more money because ultimately we lost a student population who would have gone to the school because of the sports program? Maybe it's a little bit of both, I'm not sure. So what you're trying to do is to use reasoning. So we've talked a little bit about critical thinking over the course of this semester. There's lots of different kinds of reasoning you can utilize. There's inductive reasoning that you use examples to draw a conclusion. Medical studies are a great example that if enough medical studies have the same result, you're going to draw a particular conclusion, which may or may not be accurate. We know that sometimes medical studies have been incorrect. Or deductive reasoning, you make a generalization based on, well, all of the examples that you have. So, for instance, you might deduce, for instance, that college leads to success based on the number of examples that would indicate that, but that doesn't always happen. And sometimes one can achieve success without college. Reasoning from signs, some sort of an observable mark. And again, there have been enough examples of this that you can deduce something will happen. So for instance, having a sore throat, that would be an observable mark. You could perhaps reason from that sign that you are starting to get a head cold. Lots of errors in reasoning. We do it all the time in our daily lives. The idea when you're putting together a speech is to try to avoid these errors in your speaking life and to listen for these errors when you are consuming the speeches of others and holding those people accountable. Again, we could spend an entire semester on logic and errors in reasoning. So, just very quickly, I wanted to talk about a few points. A hasty generalization, which is exactly what it sounds like. You're generalizing in too hasty or too quick of a way. There's too little evidence in order for you to make this particular generalization, but you do it anyway. Um, and take something like course schedules. If a course has been canceled or hasn't achieved a certain level of enrollment so that it has been canceled over several semesters, one might assume that the course is not popular, but there could be all kinds of other pieces in play. It could be not the course, it could be the teacher, or it could be the time, or any of a number of other factors. Appeal to ignorance, in other words, that the responsibility, the burden of proof is on the other person rather than on yourself. So prove me wrong. So I could say something completely outlandish. I'm a space alien from Mars, and I am until you can prove that I'm not. And again, the burden is supposed to be on you that proving something is the case, not on the audience or the receiver and proving something is not the case. Bandwagon fallacy, the idea that everybody wants to join the crowd, what I call the typical teenager argument that because everybody wants to go to the party and is going, you should be allowed to go as well. The sequential fallacy that there's a direct cause and effect relationship between things. Sometimes there is and sometimes there isn't. So, yes, you might have performed poorly on the quiz because you had a head cold. The thing is, you might have been performing poorly on quizzes your entire life. So, the head cold was irrelevant, let's say. Begging the question, when you're just basically rephrasing the question, circular reasoning. So, what is the faculty parking lot? It's a parking lot for faculty. I mean, that kind of circular reasoning, basically, you're just rephrasing the question. Appeal to authority, which sounds legitimate. The thing is that's usually in relation to a celebrity endorsement. The authority is somebody who's popular or somebody who's famous, not necessarily somebody who has expertise. Think about how oftentimes people in film and music are asked to support products that they really have no connection to, but the idea is that the audience admires those individuals, therefore, they would want to emulate them by having the same products that those individuals are promoting. Name calling. It's what I call the schoolyard argument. And you're not supposed to call people names. And I think I've mentioned before that this is a difficult class to teach because when you look at our real world environment, you will see individuals doing the exact opposite of what our textbook and what I'm suggesting. And yes, it's not uncommon to see public figures descend into name calling, even in the political realm, or perhaps especially in the political realm. But we should hold these individuals accountable to a higher standard because we hold ourselves and our peers in this class to a higher standard. So you shouldn't be attacking the individual. It's not about the person, it's about the issue. Or a genetic fallacy, you continue past practice purely because it's past practice. Makes a certain level of sense. After all, our legal system is based on past practice. But if you've ever been in the workplace and you've wondered, why am I filling out this form? And the response has been, because we've always done it that way, then you know how weak that argument is. Just because it's always been done that way, that doesn't mean it should be done that way. So, the last chapter that I had assigned was about diversifying speeches. It's about the importance of speakers adapting to the medium and to the occasion. So, you could be giving a face to face speech, and that's a different kind of speech than giving an online speech, which is a different kind of speech than giving a recorded speech. Now, I tried as much as possible to duplicate a face to face environment in a recorded situation, which is why I'm asking you when you record your speeches that you do not edit these speeches, that you do it in one take, much like I do it in one take when I am presenting my information to you. Though certainly if you were recording a speech and uploading it, let's say onto social media, you would have the opportunity to edit it. So there would be a level expected of perfection that wouldn't necessarily be expected in a face-to-face speech or in even an online speech. And this is an online class. It's an asynchronous online class, which means that we are not required to meet at a particular time. If we were, we would meet via Zoom, let's say, at 1 o'clock. But that said, since we're not doing that, we're recording our speeches. I'm trying to sort of combine some of the different mediums so that, yes, you're recording your speech, but you don't have the opportunity to edit it the way you would not have the opportunity to edit something if you were on Zoom in real time or in a face-to-face situation. And of course, thinking about the occasion of the speech. Is it an introductory speech? Is it an informative speech? Is it a persuasive speech? While there's similarities that are followed throughout, there are also differences. And certainly a speech for accepting an award would be different than a eulogy you might be delivering at a funeral. So there's certain expectations and social conventions that you would want to follow. Just a few things to consider. The technology, especially because technology is moving so quickly. How interactive can you be considering the medium and the occasion? And how do you address the fact that perhaps you can't be interactive? Attention spans are only decreasing, unfortunately, in our society. So, how are you going to try to maintain audience attention? Inclusivity and accessibility. How are you going to make your speech as broad as possible to appeal to the largest number of people and make it accessible enough so that if somebody has some sort of a hardship, they can still appreciate the content of your speech? And more, we have hybrid events where we're mixing and matching things like online and recorded and face to face. And all of this, the biggest piece of advice I can give you is to be flexible. So, as I had indicated, today's attendance question is going to be on speech number 2. But if you look at the notes below under the 5th section, I have listed out our course outline. And believe it or not, we are coming to the ending of the semester. So just to give you an idea of the 4 classes that are left, on Tuesday the 19th, we will have our 3rd quiz, which will be similar to quiz number 2 and quiz number 1. On the 21st, which is Thursday, you will be uploading speech number 3, your persuasive speech. On Tuesday the 26th is when you will be asked to do your speech 3 peer review. And then finally, on the last day of class, the 28th, quiz number 4. And if you'll remember, with the quizzes, there are 4 quizzes throughout the course of the semester, and I drop the lowest quiz grade so that if it turns out that you missed a quiz or you performed poorly on a quiz, you could drop that particular quiz. So I have had students who have taken the first 3 quizzes and performed well and decided not to take quiz number 4, which means that they would end the class a little bit early so that they could prepare for the fall semester, which starts shortly thereafter. So that said, getting back to our attendance question for today, please send 1 strength and 1 weakness of each of your peers' speech number 2 to my email. Again, we want to do this privately, and my email is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. By Saturday the 16th. And if you need an extension, please let me know. What I will do is I will compile all this data and share it with you in the following class, much like I did with speech number 1, with commonly cited strengths and weaknesses for all of your speeches. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.